Okay, so today we're going to be talking about the 10 steps to mastering the Fetch API. So I am going to be covering a huge range of technology associated with the Fetch API. We're going to start off talking about basic fetch calls, the idea of promises, the then catch chain, then looking at how using async await with a try catch lets you achieve the same thing with slightly different code. Moving into URL objects, request objects, and header objects. Then talking about response objects, all the different parts of the response, the different ways that we can create them and use them. Talking about general HTTP and the methods that we will be using with our fetch calls. Moving into the stuff that comes back in the response. When we get a response object back from the server, what is the different types of things that we can get, and how do we access the content inside that response object? We're going to talk about how to put HTML content onto the page based on the contents of a response, whether it's text, HTML, JSON, or images, how we can put that into web pages. We're going to talk about API keys. We're going to talk about authorization, query strings, different ways that you can use API keys, and a lot more information about headers. We're going to talk about security policies and how to protect your users on the web pages that you build. We'll talk about how to upload data, how to bundle just data from a form, data that you generate within your JSON or within your JavaScript, and also how to upload files, one or more files. We're going to talk about CORS. Now, this is something that a lot of people struggle with. So cross-origin resource sharing. How does this work when you try to make requests for data that are coming from different URLs than the origin that you're on? How does that work? So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about dealing with multiple fetch calls, either in sequence or happening at the same time. We'll talk about how to abort a fetch call. So if you start a fetch call, and it's still running, but the user wants to navigate away from your page, or they want to do something different. How do you stop that fetch call? So we'll look at doing that. And then as a bonus, after the 10th step, we'll talk about how you can actually measure the download progress of anything that you are fetching. All right, so what I have here set up, this set of files right here. If you look in the description, you'll find a link to the GitHub repo that has all this information. All these files are going to be there, including a small little web server that I've set up. This one's just for one of the items in this list. We're not going to be using it for every one of them, but we have it there just for being able to upload data, to have an endpoint where we can upload files. So I have broken this up into a whole bunch of little files, and what we're going to do is just import this method from each of these files and call the one method. So we will just comment and uncomment these files one at a time to look at those. Okay, step number 1, basic fetch. So jumping into here, in our basic fetch file, we want to look at what is the simplest way that we can do a fetch call with the default values for absolutely everything and anything. So inside my method, I want to fetch this endpoint. Now, if I were to take this and just jump into the browser right here, we take a look at that. Here we go. This is the result. I'm going to fetch this JSON file. Now, it's an array that's filled with a whole bunch of objects. That's what JSON is. It's arrays and objects, it's strings, numbers, booleans, all that fun stuff. So I want to get this data, but I don't want to replace my current web page with that data. That's the purpose of fetch. We want to be able to tell JavaScript to tell the browser, hey, I would like a copy of this file so that I can use it and then generate some data. I want to take all the names out of all these objects and build a list on the page or something else. So we want to get some data and we want to use it as part of our web page without having to refresh the entire web page. That's the idea behind fetch. So what is the simplest way that we can do this? Well, we have this command called fetch. So every browser supports this. Every browser since about 2016 has supported this command, fetch. And we can pass to it a string that is a URL. So this is the one that I want to get. And there's a whole bunch of options that we can set, but like I said, we're going to use the most simple method with all the default values. So this is all that we have to pass in, this string we pass to the method. I can save it. I can run it. That has actually run. If I go into my network tab here, we can see in the network tab that sure enough, a fetch was done to this user's endpoint, this URL, and here is the data that came back. So we got that data coming back to the browser. We're still on the same page, but we did actually fetch the data. Now, if I want to use that data on my page, what I need to do is I need to add more to this. So we're going to put a couple of methods called then chained onto the end here. Now I can write them all in the same line, but it's much easier to read if you write them like this, stacked one on top of the other. The fetch method returns something called a promise. Basically, it's a wrapper around the response that's coming back. In the browser, when we pasted this URL in, we got a response that came back from this web server. It sent us back a response object. Inside that response object was the JSON file that we're looking at right here. So over here, I want to do the same sort of thing. I'm going to say, hey, go get me the response object from that URL. When you get it back, this then method will sit there and wait until the response has come back. So I can put a function inside of here. So we can write it like this, just a standard function, or you can write an arrow function like this. So inside of here, what's going to be passed into this function? I could also use a named function. If I had a function here called Fred, then somewhere else on my page, here's that function Fred. The then method will take whatever was inside the promise that this thing returned, which is our response object, and it'll pass it to this function. So we will have a response object. You don't have to use the full word response. This is a variable. I could do resp or res, something like that, rep. But this is the response object that is coming back from here. Now, Fred. Okay, I'm going to skip over that. I'm going to make this a little bit simpler with an arrow function, but I still get this response object. There we go. So here is my function. Instead of having a named function over here, I've just got an anonymous arrow function. This is the response that came back from the server. If I do console.log, I can take a look at this response object. There it is. Here is the response. This is the URL. This is where we sent the request to. And what was the status? Status was 200. Everything was good. We got back what we were expecting to see. Fantastic. So I have my response. Usually you'll want to check and see if the thing that came back actually did work. And that is actually the purpose of having this catch at the end here. If something went wrong. So when we do the first fetch, if we're unable to connect to the network, this command will fail, and down here we will get an error object. So again, we have a function inside of here. My error object will be coming from here, or it could be coming from this then, or it could be coming from this then. If there's a failure anywhere in any of these, the error will be passed down to this catch method. So inside of here, we can console.warn, let's say, the message. We can take a look at that if something failed. Now, inside of here, we always want to do error handling. You always want to check for problems at every step. So if my fetch got a result, but the result was, say, a 404 error, maybe I mistyped the name of this. So that's going to fetch, but it's going to return a 404 error. So we can check that. We can say, okay, what is the status? There's a status property. There it is, 404. We got a 404 error. And right here, this is the error message that's happening down here. So this thing failed to get, the browser is telling us that this fetch failed, and it's writing out an error message. This isn't the console.warn, sorry. This is the browser writing out an error message to say that the fetch failed. But in ours, we know what the status is, 404. It didn't exist. There is no page called this. I want to check and make sure that the status is somewhere in the 200s. With HTTP status codes, the 100s are all an intermediate status. The 200s are all, hey, everything worked out. 300s, things are probably good, but there was some sort of redirect or something like that that happened. So you asked for this resource, but I gave you this one instead. I still gave you something, but there was something that had to be changed about it. The 400s, there was something wrong with the request. I couldn't complete the request because you didn't have permission. You didn't give me the API key. There was something wrong with the request. 404, the page isn't there. So request was sent, response came back, but there was something wrong. And then anything in the 500s, that is server-side error. So the programming on the server side failed for whatever reason. Now, I want to know if everything is in the 200 to 299 range. And that's what we're going to do here. We're going to say if response, or my resp variable here, .ok. If it's okay, it means that it was in the 200 to 299 range. If it's not, so I'll do this. If not okay, I will throw new error. And we can write some sort of message so that it comes up. And this one we will see here. We change this, so we will get a 404 error. This will catch it, throw an error. The error will come down into this catch, and this function right here will run because we're generating an error. There we go. Was not a valid response. Now, if I change this back to the proper users, there we go. I don't see the error message happening. So instead, what I want to do is I want to take the response that came back, and I know it's a JSON file, so I want to extract from the response the JSON data. I want to take the string that's inside the file, which I know is a JSON string, and I want to turn it into a JavaScript object. So we will return resp.json, and this is a method to extract JSON string and convert it to an object. All right. Returning from a then will take us to the next then. This is going to return a promise, and the promise will sit here in front of the then until it has resolved. When the promise is ready. So basically what we're saying is whenever this method is finished extracting the JSON string, converting it into an object, when all that's done, this function will be called. So we're doing fetch, and then we're going to call this function, and then we're going to call this function. And the cool thing about then is it's always going to wait. And so our data object right here, if I console.log the data object, we can see the contents. There it is. It's an array with 10 objects, just like we saw here. It's an array that has inside of it 10 objects. There we go. Same thing that we have right here. And now, this is a JavaScript object, like any JavaScript variable. And if I want to build HTML content with it, I can, which we're going to get into in a future step. All right, so we have this. Now, why do we use the then? One last thing in this first step. Why do we use the then? And it's because I can't do this. I can't say, hey, I want to go get that data. And I'm going to put the result. Here's my response object. I'm going to put it inside of here. And then what I want to do is I want to get that data. Let data obj equal response.json. and console.log data obj. This is going to fail. This will not work. And it won't work because we're not waiting right here. We're saying, go do this thing. Now, JavaScript is going to be happy enough to send that request off. It'll say, okay, I'll go and I'll get that stuff for you. And it looks at first glance like what it's going to do is it's going to say, all right, we'll put the response object into here. But this is going to be a promise object. Because this thing returns a promise object. It doesn't return the response. It returns a promise object that sits here waiting until whatever it is done. When it's complete, then this is the contents of that promise. Here, we're returning JSON string turned into a JavaScript object, wrapped in a promise that sits here until we have the actual data. Then it gets passed into here. Here, we're not waiting. So this is going to fail. There we go. Uncaught type error. Response.json is not a function. So we can't call response because this thing is a promise object. Promise objects don't have a method called response or called JSON. So this will fail every time. All right, so that's the end of step 1. That's your basic fetch. That's understanding promises. That's understanding the sequence, how we can chain these things together with the thens, how you always should have a catch at the very end of it. Because we always want to do error handling. We always want to check and make sure that things worked at every step along the way. Okay, moving on to number 2. So the alternate syntax. Moving into here, try an async. So this is the different syntax than the promise, where we were doing fetch .then.catch, and we were doing that because this returns a promise, and then we were returning a promise from here, and this was the last step in our sequence, and this was here to catch an error at any step along the way. Now, if you want, you can say that your function is asynchronous. Meaning, if you do anything inside this function that uses a promise, you can use the keyword await to pause at that step. So what do I mean by that? Well, I can do a fetch for the URL, and I'm using the same one as before. And that thing that I was saying never to do, we can say, hey, here's my response object. And then from my response object, I'm going to get my data object. And we're going to say, we've got a response, and from the response, I got to extract the JSON. And you can see it automatically did this for me. This is what we want to do. In front of the fetch, in front of the response.json, anywhere that we are going to call a method which returns a promise, which is something that needs to wait for a little while before getting a response. We do this. Because it's asynchronous, we're allowed to do this. We can say, all right, call a fetch, but don't assign the result to this variable until after it comes back. Again, here, don't do anything until we've got the response back. So we can console.log response here, and we will have an actual response object. And then down here, console.log data object, we will actually have the data object coming back. There it is. There's my response, and there it is. See, this is in my second file. So I'm getting the same results, doing the same thing. So a lot of people will look at this and go, okay, this is much simpler, shorter. It's only 2 lines of code. I don't have to write all the thens inside of here. My personal preference is to use the then chain. I like how it encapsulates all this functionality. But I know that that is not everybody's preference. Some people do prefer this syntax. The downside of this syntax is we can't just leave it like this because we have 0 error handling here. If we want to do error handling, we still have to add that in here. We have to wrap all this code inside of a try block with a catch. And here's the error at the end, like this. So now I can do console.warn. Here's my error message. So if I tab this all in, this will handle failing the fetch, but the response, I still need to check and make sure the response is okay. So I still have to do this. I still have to say, if not response.ok, throw new error. And that comes down here. So let's test this. It should be working just fine. Yes, there we go. We've got everything working. But with the try catch, now we have some error handling. So let's try it out with an invalid URL. Now I get the 404 error, which means that this should trigger an error, which should go down to the catch. And there we are. Here's the response. That's this one on line 11. And then the error comes down, and line 16, that is our console.warn right here. So this part's not running. We're never getting to this part of our code because we are throwing an error, and that jumps down to the catch. Same sort of approach, just a different way of writing the code. So we've got try catch instead of the fetch then catch. Two different ways of doing it. Both work. It's just whichever syntax feels more comfortable to you, whichever one you feel is more readable. They are both valid syntaxes. All right, so that is the end of number 2. Moving on to number 3, understanding more of the parts that come with fetch. So what do we mean by parts? Well, there's other objects, and in that first simple version of the fetch call that we were making, we were using all the default values. So now we're going to start looking at some of those other options, the other parts of the things that we're passing into fetch, the things that fetch is doing by default. So a URL. When you call fetch like this, what we put inside of here could be a string, which is what we were doing before, something like this. This is a URL string. We can put a URL object. So that's what we're going to build first of all. So that's one of the things that we're going to look at here. A URL object. You can pass a string like this into the URL constructor, and it's going to give you a URL object. So what's the benefit of that? Well, if you had this string and you were using this string, nothing wrong with it. It's going to work fine with fetch. But if you needed to get at any of the bits and pieces, so what if I only want the path, the folder and file name? What if I only wanted the port number? What if I wanted the protocol? What if I wanted the domain? What if I wanted the origin? What if I wanted just the query string? So there's all these other parts, or the hash value. There's all these different pieces that make up a URL. Yes, I can use string methods to say, okay, split it wherever there's a /, find a question mark, find the hashtag. You know, there's all these things that we can use to extract bits and pieces, but it's a lot more code than, hey, if I just had the property name, that's going to work just fine. So inside of here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, here's my URL, create a new URL object, and there's two ways we can write it. We can just pass this string in, which is the way that I typically do it, but you can also split it into two pieces. There could be a string, which you can think of as being this part of the URL, or the base, which is this part. So if you split it up, you can have the base and this as two separate strings, or just pass in the whole thing, which is what I'm going to do right here. There we go. I have created a URL object. Console.log URL.host, URL.origin, URL.protocol, .port, path name, and so on. There's all these properties that I have up here. These are all bits and pieces of what we have inside that URL. right. Oh, we have to go back to our main page, and we have to switch this over to number 3. We're no longer on number 2. And there we are. So there it is. There's the origin. Here's the protocol. Here's the port. This is the path name, which is the folder and file name. This is the host. So we've got all these different bits and pieces that we get for free just by wrapping the string inside of a URL object. The fetch, it's happy to take a string. It's happy to take a URL object. It's also, here we can just quickly throw on a then just to show that it works. So my response object, I'll just write out the status. So give us a 200. There it is. There's the 200 status coming up. So string, URL, 2 the different things that we can pass into a fetch. The third one is a request object. There's actually a request object that we can build. So I can say const request equals new request. So a request object, you can see here, we can pass in a URL object right here, and then there's an init property. So there's an object where we can put a whole bunch of settings inside of. So let's do that. I'm going to pass in my URL. Just like fetch, the request is going to be able to accept a string or a URL object. Then there's options. So inside of here, in the request, what are things that you might want to put in there? Well, headers. There is a headers object, a headers setting, where I can set up various headers. Now, I'm just going to throw one in here as a sample. We'll come back and talk more about headers later on, but we can put x/Steve, and the value is going to be hello. There we go. So I've created a header, and I've put it inside of there. There's different ways of creating it. This is the most basic with no error handling whatsoever, but I'm just going to throw it in there just to show that we can do that. The method. The default method that we use for every fetch call, unless we specify otherwise inside the request, is get. Now, I will come back and talk more about these methods, but get you can think of basically as read. I want to read some data from the server. I want to go and get a file. I want to get an image, get a JSON file. That's what get is. I'm not sending any data to the server necessarily. I just want to get something back. So that's what this means. And then, once the stuff comes back, what do I want to do with it? Well, there is a property called cache, and you can set it to one of these values right here. So the default, if I set it as that, so this is, if I'm not putting anything in there, means this. Cache first. So I'm going to go and check in the browser's HTTP cache. So every time you visit a web page, the browser is saving those files that it brings and downloads. So the HTML, the CSS, the JavaScript, the images, all those things are being saved in your browser. That's the history of your browser. It's saving all of these things. It's caching them in an HTTP cache. So this is all HTTP cache, not to be confused with the Cache API, which is another topic, which there's a video that I've done on that. If you look up at the top there, you'll find that. So not the Cache API, but an HTTP cache in the browser. So save it to the cache, or look in the cache first to see if it's there. If it's there, but it's too old, it's expired, it's gone beyond its best before date, then we're going to send a request off to the server. And if the server says it has a newer copy, we will download it and we will update the cache. We'll replace what's in the cache. Reload means always go to the cache. Don't bother checking the cache first. Just go to the server, get the new one, bring it back, and put the new one in the cache. No store means always go to the server, but don't bother updating my cache. Just get a new copy off the server. Don't save it. No cache means make a request to the server and say, here's the current age of what I've got. Do you have a newer version? And if it does, it will send back the new one, and we will update the cache and use the latest version that came back from the server. Force cache. If there's nothing in the cache, make the request and then save it. Only if cache means don't bother ever sending a request to the server. Just go and look in the cache. If it's there, use it. If not, this is the error that we will get. So right here, we can say cache. This is a setting for the request. This is in the options object for the request. And I'm going to set this to, let's say, no store. So I'm not going to bother saving it in my cache. So here, I can put the string, the str from up here. I can put the URL. I can put my request object. Any of those are going to work. To bring back our response, there it is. There's our 200 response. So we should always have our then for the data handling and our catch with the error. So we will say pass it to console.warn. So that's going to be the error message. Inside of here, we will check to make sure it worked. So if not response .ok, throw new error. And then we want to have the data, so we will extract the data from there by returning the call to response.json. And I'm calling response.json because this is going to be a JSON file. It's my local JSON file that I created. So this is coming back. And the data is going to be here, and I can console.log the data. So this is the JavaScript object created from the JSON string that was inside the response object. And there it is. There is our JSON data, the JavaScript object. So it is a object. All right, so that is number 3. Working with these URL objects, working with the request objects, the headers object. So we will come back and talk more about the headers object, but just be aware that this is like settings for the request that are going to be, there's some settings that happen in the browser, some that happen on the server. And we're going to talk more about those coming up. Moving on to number 4. Understanding the response. So we got a response object, sure, but there's a lot more to it than just this method. So let's take a look at that. So in my response, I've got a little bit here set up already. I have a bunch of examples. So these are strings pointing to different files. One's a JSON file, one's an image, one's a font file, one's an HTML file. So we have all these different files. We can make requests for any of those using fetch. When we do the fetch, we know we get back a response object. We look at the OK property to see that it worked. But it is also possible for us to build our own response objects. So let's look at what a response object actually is. I have an object here. So JavaScript object, plain ordinary JavaScript object. I'm going to turn that into a JSON string right here. So I'm calling json.stringify. I'm turning this into a string. So we can do this in 2 steps. So let's say my JSON string is this. There we go. And then that string, I'm putting it inside of an array, and I pass it to a file constructor. So I'm building a brand new file. This is what I'm going to call it. And this is the MIME type, the data type of the file. Then I can build a new response object. So I don't even have to go and make a fetch call to create a response object. Now, that's the whole purpose of what we're learning here today, is about fetch calls, and we will look at some different ones here in a minute, but this is what a response object is. It's a container that has a file inside of it. This is the body of the response. So every HTTP request and response, it's basically an object. So we've got this HTTP request object. There's an HTTP response object that comes back from the server. Both of them are constructed the same way. There's a head and a body. Both of them have these two parts to them. There's also a footer as well, but we never touch the footer. We don't have to worry about it. We can forget that it even exists, and it won't affect anything that we do. So let's just think of it as these two parts. Inside the head, this is where all the settings are. This is where we have those things like the cache setting and the headers, the actual headers saying, hey, I'm using the get method. Here's the URL that I'm going to. This is the port number that I'm using. Here's the status code of the response. All these things are inside the head. The body is the actual file. That's what we have down here. This file that we created, that we pass into here, that is the body. It is possible that the response is null. There is nothing inside of there. When we make a GET request to the server, this is null. It is empty. When you make a GET request, you're not allowed to put anything inside the body. The response will hopefully have something in the body. Now, it's possible that it's empty, it's null, but most of the time you will have something inside that body. So here is my body. This is in my response object. And then 3 settings, 3 properties inside the options object for the response. A status code to say, hey, it's good or it's bad. Status text. It can be whatever you want. Typically, if it's 200, that means okay. So you'd write something like that. And then headers. We had some headers before. We had written out that object with the string inside of it. Here's a couple of actual headers. If you're building custom headers, like this, we can come up with our own names, but they have to start with the letter X. So there's the value, here's the name. If it starts with an X, you can create whatever headers you want. But there are headers that you're allowed to use, and there's other ones that you're not allowed to touch, you're not allowed to change. It's only the browser that is allowed to set them. Here we have content type and content length. So in my response object, I've got this file. This is the kind of file that it is, and this is the size in bytes of that file. So we can console.log this response object that we got back. And there it is. So here, line 20, this is the object. Right here. This object, here's the string version of it, which is the contents of our file. And then our response that we built, we're taking a look at the response object. There it is. Status 200, status text, say my name. And we can look to see what those headers are if we want. So in our response, we can say, hey, I want to look at the headers inside of there. Can you get me the header called content type? Can you get me the header called content length? I want to take a look at those headers inside this response object. There it is. So anytime that you need to read the headers from a response object, assuming you're accessing ones that you're allowed to access, you're not allowed to access all of them, remember that. But assuming that they are there and you're allowed to access them, this is how you do it. Response.headers.get, and then the name of the header. So dealing with fetch calls and these response objects, we can do fetch calls for these. Let me just comment that one out. So we'll just very quickly test a couple of these to take a look at them. So I'm going to look for the image string. And again, I can use the string. I can create a URL object. I can create a request object. Then we get our response coming back. We will check if response.ok is not true. Throw new error. And we will return from this first then the response dot. Now this is not JSON. This is an image. So instead of doing response dot JSON, we're going to do response dot blob. Blob stands for binary large object. Basically, it means that this is a binary file. It's not a text file. This is an image. It's a video. It's a media file of some sort. It's a font. So it's not text. And inside of our next then, we get a blob coming back. And we'll have our catch at the very end. And this is another way that you can write it. I'm just going to write out my error object. So if there's an error object passed into here, it will be passed to this named function. So warn is a function or a method inside the console object. So I am passing the error object to that function. So instead of writing out error.message, it'll write out the whole error, but that's okay. We have here the blob. And if I try to console log that, there we go. This is what I get. Blob, it tells me the size, it tells me the type. That's about all that it can tell me. It can't show me the binary data, but it can say, okay, it's a blob object. Now, if I ever wanted to do something with that, like put this in my page, I could do that. I can turn this, which is basically a chunk of memory. So they have now this blob that's stored in memory somewhere. So we've got this chunk of data that's saved in memory. I want to use it. I want to put it here in my HTML. I've got right here this image tag called pic. I want to put it inside of there. I want to replace this image with this one that I got back. So to do that, I have to create a URL. Basically, I have to find a way of pointing to that place in memory where this thing is saved. So I will create a URL using that URL object that we've talked about before, but it has a method called createObjectURL. We just have to pass it our blob. I'm going to say, here, I've got a bunch of memory. Can you create a URL that points to that spot in memory for me? Then my image, I will get a reference to that, get element by ID, pic, and we will set the source of that equal to this new URL that we just created. There it is. Now this image is a different aspect ratio than the one that we had here, but this is it. We have replaced that original. Here, if I comment this one line out, there's the original image. Run that again. There it is, replaced with the one that we fetched from the server. So we went off to pixum.photos, got an image, brought it back. And here, let's change these to match. So we'll say 300 and 200. Now it'll have the same aspect ratio. There we go. There's our cute little puppy image. Other ones work the same way. So for a font, we're going to get back the reference to the file that's going to be saved in memory, but then I can write some CSS. I can create a style tag and write some CSS that will point to the create object URL. This URL that we create, I would use that as the value for my source inside of an @fontface style for HTML when that comes back. Instead of using blob, we could do response.text. That's for text files. Response.json, we've already talked about. That's for JSON files. This one is for text, HTML, and XML files, and CSS, and JavaScript, anything that's text-based. Blob is for images, video, audio, fonts, things like that. All right, so let's switch over to number 5 here. And for number 5, what I have is starting code does the same thing with the image. So we are going to pick some. That's our fetch call. We're going to call the blob method on the response object, which will give us this blob that we can use with the URL create object URL method. So it gives us a URL that points at that location in memory. And let's just console log that just so we can see it again here. And yeah, there we are. Here it is. So this is the URL that we're looking at that is being used for this image. So it's not the URL that was on the Pixum website. It's the data that came back that was saved in memory by our fetch call. That was turned into a URL on our local site where it can be used for this image. All right, now we've got 2 other kinds of data here. We've got some JSON data and some text data as well. So this is pointing to our server right here, the server that I've got. This is a simple GET request. So we'll do this one first. What I'm going to do is inside my header, I'm going to add an H2 with the text that's coming from here. So we've got fetch of text string. We'll get our response object. In the response object, we always want to check to make sure that what came back was valid. If not, we're going to throw an error. Now, this is plain text, so instead of the JSON method, instead of the blob method, we're going to call text. This is another method that the response object have. Actually, all 3 of these, text, blob, and JSON, all belong to the body object, but the response object has access to that method. So there we are. We call then. This will give us the text from that. Here's our catch. If there's a problem, we'll write it out there. And in my header, I'm going to say the inner HTML is going to be equal to itself plus. There we go. We're adding an H2 element. And inside of that, we're going to put this text. So I used backtick characters. And this is my preferred approach to writing new HTML based on data. If you use the backtick characters around your HTML string, you can embed variables like this. So this is called interpolation, where you're sticking in variables inside of that. So we are now getting an H2 element as well as an image being set. By calling the text method, we get the text to write inside of here. By calling the blob method, we get the raw binary data that we can then turn into a URL and use inside of our image element. And the other one is the JSON data. Now, this is the most common of all the methods. This is the one that you're going to be using the majority of the time, I would imagine. We've got our response object, so a lot of the same stuff is done regardless of the kind of file that you're looking at. If everything works out, we always want to be doing our error handling. So if everything does not work out properly, we're going to throw an error. So we'll have another then, and we'll have our catch, console.warn, there we go. And at the end of this, this is going to be the JSON file that comes back. Our response object is going to contain the JSON file that comes from the server. From that JSON file, we want to extract the data. So we're going to take the string, we're going to pull the string out of the file and then turn it from a JSON string into a JavaScript object. And that's what the JSON method does for us. So we're going to call this response.json method, which is going to return a promise. The promise will then sit here in front of this then method. So the result of this then will be the promise that sits here. When it resolves, so when we actually get the JavaScript object, then this then method will call our function inside of here, and we will have our data object. Or let's call it a data array, because that's what it is. That's what we're getting back here from this endpoint. And if I were to open that up in the browser, right here, this is what we're getting back. This is the URL. It is an array that has 10 objects inside of it. Every one of them with the same properties. Now, I'm not going to use all these properties. I'm not going to write all this data out to the page, but I will take a few of these properties. So just to demonstrate, we're going to take first name and last name, those two properties, and we're going to take this, the user ID. So those three things. We're going to build some HTML using that. Now, if I jump back in here to my HTML file, here is my list. Here's the UL element. And inside of here, what we want to build is something like this. There's going to be a list item, and inside of it, I'm going to have their first name. I'm going to have their last name, like this, inside of a couple paragraphs. And then inside the list item, this is where I want to put that UID. You know, something like this, not exactly this. So let's copy this just to demonstrate. Doesn't matter that I'm missing the first letter here. When you want to add data into an HTML element, maybe I want to be able to later on have a click listener added to the UL. So when somebody clicks one of the list items, I can look to the UID value and know which one that was clicked. So if I have to then go back and reference that original data, I can find a match. The problem is, we're not allowed to do this. We're not allowed to invent our own properties. I can't create a property called that and stick it into the HTML. I can technically write it, yes, I just did, but it's not valid HTML. If you want to add your own custom properties, like a user ID, you have to do this. You have to add the data prefix in front of it. So data, hyphen, and then the name that you want to make up. So now we have this attribute called data UID that I can access from my HTML. I can create it when I'm generating this HTML, and I can access it later with a click listener. Okay, so we have all this. This is effectively what I want to create. So I'm going to copy that. I'm going to comment that out. Now, there are many ways that you can create the content inside there. We can call create element, create document fragment. There's a whole bunch of different things that you can do to actually create the content. My preferred approach is this. Here's my UL. This is the list variable. So list.innerHTML. Now, we did this for the header right here. We said just add to it. Here, I'm not adding to it. I'm replacing whatever's inside there with new content. We're going to take our data array, and we're going to call the map method. The array map method allows you to loop through an array. What it does is it returns a brand new array. So I'm going to take an array of objects and turn it into an array of strings. These strings are each going to be a piece of HTML. So there's going to be one piece of HTML for each one of the objects that we're getting from this server. So this object will have a piece of HTML that represents it. And that's what we had as our demo here. This. We're going to generate one of these for each one of those objects in this array. Now, I can't take an array and assign it to inner HTML because it's just going to say object array or object object. That's pretty useless. So I'm going to take this array and I'm going to combine every one of those strings into a single string. I'm going to join them all together as one big string that gets assigned here. Inside of here, we've got our item, and we're going to return, and I'm going to put backtick characters around it, the same as I did down here, so I can put variables inside of it. This is what I want to build. This is the HTML that I wanted to build. So in here, instead of this, it's going to be item.uid. So item was my variable, item.uid. And right here, it's going to be item.first_name. And this one's going to be item.last_name. There we have it. So that will work. That will generate it. There we go. There's all of our data. And if we inspect one of these, we can see, hey, look, there's all the unique IDs as well. So we have all that data coming out. Now, if I wanted to add a class name, that's easy enough to do. I can add something like that. There we go. Now I've got some CSS. I can tie into my CSS file. Very easy to do. There's one thing I can do to simplify this a little bit, and that is here. Instead of putting a variable item that I then have to access the properties, there's only 3 properties that I want. In the actual data, there's lots of properties that I don't care about. I only want those 3, so I'm going to use destructuring. Instead of putting item, I'm going to do this. This is the object, and the things that I want from the object are the UID, the first name, and the last name. Those 3 properties are all that I care about. So I'm destructuring the object to get those 3 things, and that means down here, I don't have to put item in front of each one of them. This becomes much easier for myself and other developers to read. So I can see, here's this nice chunk of HTML. There's 3 variables, the UID, the first name, the last name. Those properties were well named in the data, so why not use those same names here? And there we have it. We've got the data being built. And one of the most important things about this approach is that we have one command. All this HTML is being added at the same time. We're not coming in here and inside the loop saying inner HTML is equal to what it was plus this new value, and doing this again and again and again, forcing the browser to redraw the page with every single element that we add, one after another, redraw the page, redraw the page, redraw the page. We don't want to do that. We want to minimize the number of times that the browser is forced to rebuild the page because we're changing the content. Here, I'm changing it once. I'm building one big string and saying, here, add this data. So one time it changes the DOM and it redraws the screen. All right, and so now that's the end of number 5. Number 6, let's move on to authorization and credentials. We come down here and move on to that. There we are, moving on to number 6. All right, so talking about API keys now. What is an API key? Well, API stands for Application Programming Interface. Basically, in the context of Fetch, what we're talking about is a web server somewhere that can provide you with files. It can provide you with JSON files or HTML files or XML files. And this data will be sent to you depending on what URL you use. So which endpoint is what the URLs are called. So the different URLs are different endpoints, and for you to be allowed to access the data, many APIs, most APIs, will require you to have a key. So you have to register with them, and they will give you a key. It's just a unique identifier that says you are the person who's requesting this data. And by doing that, they can keep track of how many requests you're making, which endpoints you're requesting, if you're allowed to access certain endpoints, or how many times you're allowed to access those different endpoints. So API keys, once you've registered and you have this key, it's something that you want to keep secret. Most of the time, when you're building a website, what you'll want to do is you'll want to be making these fetch calls from the web server. And by doing it on the web server, you can put the API key into an environment variable. So it's a variable that's not written inside your code. Now, there are some, like Google Firebase, where they will have multiple keys that you're using, and one of them is intended to be used in the browser. So it's okay to have it in your code, because there's other keys that are on the server, and it's the combination of these keys that's going to work to allow people to have access. So it doesn't matter if somebody gets the key that you put in the browser, they still don't have your server-side key. So in this example, we're just going to be talking about those instances where in the browser, you have this key, and you're going to have it in your client-side code. So where can we put it? So different places that we can put it. The keys can go in the query string. They can be in the headers. Those are probably the two most common, but also in cookies. Now, cookies I'm listing here as a separate thing, but really, cookie is a header. Inside the headers, there is one called setCookie, or setCookie2. And these headers will contain, or can contain, the API key. They can contain lots of little bits of text information, identifiers, session IDs, things like that can be inside these cookies. So these are different places that we can put them to send them to the server. When we make a fetch call, we're going to be placing them in different places. So when I make my fetch call, I want to use a request object because it's going to let me access all these different things. So we can create a URL. So here's my string. We'll do something like the one from JSON placeholder. Actually, let's use the one that I've got up and running here. So we've got this server. This is a very, very basic, simple Express Node.js server. I've got get, post, put, patch, delete. These endpoints are set up here. Now these endpoints are the HTTP methods. So get, remember, was the default. Get means I'm just getting some data. I'm requesting some data. Post is I'm uploading something. I'm creating a new thing on the server. Put and patch are both for I'm updating something. Put is I'm replacing the old thing. Patch is I'm changing part of the thing that's on the server. Delete, straightforward, you're deleting something on the server. So I'm just creating these different endpoints so that I can use it to upload files and do things. So I'm going to use this as my endpoint. And I'm listening on port 3000. So basically, what I'm doing is I'm going to http://127.0.0.1:3000. This is the endpoint that I'm using for get and post. For these other threes, I would have to add something afterwards, and whatever this value is would be represented by this variable ID. Okay. When you take this, just make sure that you have it in a separate server. In the terminal, you would navigate into this folder. So you will do this. You'll say cd into server once you've got a copy of this whole project. And then you want to do npm install, which will install Express and Cores, these two things that are being used. And then to start it, you just have to say node main. And that will run the server. So that's what I have done here. And if we open up my terminal, you can see I read node main, and it is listening on port 3000. So this is actually running right now, this server. It's been running the whole time I've been recording this. So this is my endpoint. that I'm going to be calling from here. So we do this, then we can say, I'm going to create a URL from that. So we pass in our string, and then in the request object, the first thing that we pass in is a URL, and then an options object equals new request. There we go. So we're creating a URL object and a request object. Now, the other things that we haven't really talked about in here, the query string, question mark is the start of it, and you can think of these as just like variables. So there's a name and a value. So here's the name of the variable, here's the value of the variable. And you can create as many of these as you want, like that. So name, name, value, value. You separate them with ampersands. This whole thing is the string value inside of here, the search value inside my URL object. URL dot search will be that string, or there is a URL search params object. So we can access that property. So let's say SP is my search params object. It's going to be URL.searchParams. So this is an actual search params object. We can access the values. We can add new values. We can say sp.append. So this is a much quicker and easier way to work with all these values instead of having to work with them as a string. So if we're talking about an API key, like we were talking about earlier, then with the API key, we could add it like this. We could say append API key, and then the value is whatever that API key string is. So I've added my API key into the query string. So in my server, in this get or post or whatever the request is, if inside of here, in the request object, it is looking for something in the query string called API-key, like this, or XAPI key, or whatever it's called. If it's looking for something, then this is the way we have to add it in. Now, if it's not looking for it in the query string, maybe it's looking for it in the headers. So we could have here, let's say we'll set our method to get, and our headers. Now we could do this again like we did before, just an object literal where we write out all the values. Or the better way to do this, it's a little bit more long-winded, but the better way to do it, I'm going to create a variable called h, which will be my headers object. So h is new headers. So why do I do this? Well, I'm going to do append like I did here. So h.append, and we can set, content type and so on, all those headers. If I was uploading a file, then I would add content type. If I was uploading, if I'm doing a post and I'm uploading a JSON file, I would add this header. I'm not doing that. I'm just making a GET request to the server. But inside the headers, if I was to do this, the headers object is actually going to do some testing and checking to make sure that we've got some valid headers. We're not making up things or trying to change ones, more importantly, trying to change ones that we're not allowed to change, like the origin. This is a header that is set by the browser. We in JavaScript are not allowed to change the origin. So we're running right now on this origin, HTTP 127.0.0.1 port 5500. That is our origin. That's where our server is. We're not allowed to change it to something else. I can't say that, oh yeah, I'm actually coming from https cia.org. I'm not allowed to do that. The browser won't let me do that. It's going to check these headers and say, no, this is not a valid one. You're not allowed to use this. So that's the most important reason why we do this. So we add the headers object in here, but we can set up whatever headers we want. So maybe there's going to be one for the API key that we call X API key. So remember, if you're creating headers yourself, if you're making up the names, the headers have to start with an X. Just like in the HTML, when you're adding your own attributes, they have to start with data and a hyphen. In the headers, you've got to start with X and then the name. So here's my key right here. So this is the key that I'm passing up. So maybe you need it in the query string, maybe you need it in here, in this header, one that you make up, or there is another one called authorization. And this one is like this. This is how you would send a JSON web token. So this is a very common type of authorization that you would get from the server. So they create on the server a JSON web token. It's a base 64 encoded string that contains encoded information like your user ID. And this string is sent, and then on every subsequent request, you're supposed to send this to the server. So using the built-in header called authorization, the word bearer, and your JWT token, like this. So this is an API key, and this one would be your JavaScript web token. Or sorry, not JavaScript, JSON web token. So we have this token with the word bearer and a space between them goes inside of here. So different ways that we can send this information off to the server. Part of the query string, in a custom header, or in the authorization header. It's possible that the API key, they want it sent like this. But whatever the reason, whatever the method, whatever the approach, we just add the headers in here like this. Now, depending on what headers you're setting, it is important to be aware that there are forbidden header names. There are certain headers that you're allowed to set in a request. There's certain headers you're allowed to set in a response. There's too many to go through and list them all, but if you go onto the Mozilla Developer Network website and you search for forbidden header names, you will find the list of all the different names that you're allowed to use, ones that you're not allowed to set through JavaScript, ones that you are allowed to set, ones that you're allowed to set in requests, and ones that you're allowed to set in responses. There's not a lot for the responses, but this is what we do. So we create our request object with the URL that includes the search params. We set our method, we add the headers, and then we can do our fetch. And we do our then, and catch. We get our response. We check. Extra set of parentheses there. Return response. Now I know my API right here is just going to be returning text each time. There we go. We'll just write out what the text is. And here's our page. And there it is. That's the text that's coming back. This hello world. That is what we're sending right here. If we changed our method, if we changed our approach, our method from get to post, the message changes. So we did do a post request, and then that is the endpoint that responded on the server. So post, this is the message that we get back, and the status code is a 201. And if we want to see that, we can go over to the network tab without even console logging it. If we just come over here, there it is. There's the 204 that we did for the pre-flight request. Now, cores we'll be getting into shortly. That's what this one is, this pre-flight request. That's because we're requesting something on a different origin. We're on port 5500. We're making a request to port 3000, so they're different origins. So this is a test to see if we're allowed to do this. And then 201, that's the response code for a successful post request. If we change this back to get, that 204, that's going to be gone. There is no 204 for a get. Oh, sorry, yes, we are still dealing with a different origin. So yes, we're going to get that, but the 200 code, that's the one. Instead of 201, we're getting a 200. The 200 is for the get, 201 was for a post. Okay, so that is dealing with API keys, setting up the credentials. Cookies, in JavaScript, if you need to set a cookie, you are setting the cookie for the domain that you're currently on. So this script is being loaded by this HTML file, which is on this origin. So if I call the command inside of here, if I say document.cookie, and I set my cookie with all the various values, I'm going to be setting it on this origin. I'm not going to be setting it on the origin where my server is with the port 3000. It's like they're two different computers. And cookies are not meant to be shared. They're really meant to stay with the origin that created them. So if I want to be able to do this, if I want to be able to send the cookie to the other place, then what I have to do is I have to modify my request. In the options here, we talked about having the cache one. And we set, let's say it's set to default. Another one that we can set is called credentials. Now, credentials can be set to omit. And that means if, when I send the request, I don't want to include authorization header, or I don't want to include tokens that have been set from other places. I don't want to include cookies that have been set for other places. I want to make sure that I never send with this request, with this fetch call, I'm never sending this information. It could be private information, so I don't want to send that stuff. With this one, we can say same origin, which is the default policy for cookies. It's the default policy for fetch calls. If I'm on abc.com and I'm making a fetch call to abc.com, that is the same origin. And if I'm doing a request to the same origin, the browser says, okay, I assume that you trust yourself and that you're not going to be sharing bad information. You're not going to be requesting things that you're not supposed to request. It's on the same origin, so go ahead and request whatever it is that you want to request. Make the fetch to whatever resource you want. But if you're making a request to a different origin, and this is set to same origin, well, that's automatically going to say cookies cannot be sent. There's no cookies that are going to be sent along with this. So we can set it to omit, meaning I never want to send it. I can set it to same origin, meaning if I'm making a fetch call to the same origin, yeah, you can go ahead, but if I'm making it to a different origin, don't send them. Or we can change this and say include. Go ahead, send the credentials. I don't care if it's a different origin. And then we get this. This is the browser telling me you're doing something that's not really secure. You are passing around credentials. You're doing something that you really shouldn't be doing. So to protect you, to protect your users, we're going to lock down the fetch calls that you're making. We're not going to let you handle the data. There's a header here. Access control allow origin. If I go over to the network tab, inside of here, in the headers, in the response headers, oh, sorry for this one. Access control allow origin. it's set to an asterisk. It's set to a star, meaning, yeah, anybody's good. And this was something that's being sent back actually by our server right here. I'm just saying, yeah, let anybody do anything. We're just going to send the wildcard character back. And because we did that, we're saying everybody's allowed to access the data. But the browser's saying, okay, you said to include credentials. You're saying it's fine to go ahead and send tokens and cookies and all that stuff off to this other server. And the server's saying it's allowing anybody. So basically, nobody's doing anything that's secure. So I don't trust what's going on right here. I'm not going to let you actually take the data and do anything with it. Go ahead, make the fetch call, but I'm not going to let you touch this data because things just do not feel safe to me. And that's sort of the idea behind CORS, and we're going to come back and talk a little bit more about that in step number 8. All right, so for right now, let's jump back into here. We know that include is not going to work with our settings, so we're going to set credentials to omit. Now, doing this or doing same origin, either one of those, that's safe, that's fine. You're saying, if it's going someplace else, don't send my cookies. If I'm on something that I control, go ahead, we're good to do that. And one last thing that I want to talk about here before we go on to number 7 and uploading data is the content security policy. In your HTML files, you can add a meta tag with HTTP equivalent set to content security policy. And what you do inside of here, in this string for the content, you define what the browser is allowed to do, where it's allowed to get its resources from. So my default is the fallback for absolutely everything. Now, normally you wouldn't put an asterisk here and say, yeah, okay, you can get anything from anywhere, I don't care. That's not very safe. I do it here just to avoid some having to write the full thing out. My scripts can come from the same origin as my HTML or unsafe inline. I had to include this one because the live server script that VS Code injects to run this server on port 5500 needs this one. But this is the reason why I bring this up. Connect source. When you are doing fetch calls, this is the one that you are going to be using. Connect source is where are you allowed to make fetch calls to. It doesn't matter if you're requesting an image file, a CSS file, a font file, an HTML file, an XML file. It doesn't matter the kind of file. If you're doing fetch, connect source is what you're going to have to set. So each of these values, default source, script source, connect source, image source, style source, font source, there's a whole bunch more. All these different sources, it's just a space-separated list of places that you're allowed to get stuff. So I could say, okay, inside of here, if I'm connecting to something that is on the same domain, go ahead, that's fine. Or if I'm using HTTPS to request from anywhere, or if I'm requesting something from example.com, that's fine, I can do that. Or I can write out a full thing, HTTPS, JSON placeholder, .typecode.com, and so on and so on. Just a space-separated list of all the different places that you say it's fine to do fetch calls to. This is a space-separated list of all the different ways that you can get images or scripts, and so on. So, content security policy, we can add it to our HTML files as a meta tag, or it is a header. So this is the name of the header, and this is the value of the header. So in a response header for the HTML file, we could have this be read as a header. All right, and so that is the end of number 6. Moving on to number 7, getting into uploading data. So let's comment this one out, uncomment this one, moving into number 7, uploading. These 3 methods for HTTP, post, patch, and put. These 3 methods are the ways that you can actually upload data to the server. Now, when you upload data, it could be a JSON file, it could be a string, it could be a JavaScript object that you do JSON stringify on to add it into the body of your request that's being sent to the server. Or you can attach one or more files. So this is going to be my method that I'm going to use. Here's my endpoint, and this is why I have this server set up here, is so this is the place where I can do it. We've got our image pickers, our file pickers for images and JSON. That's these things right here. Oh, I'm going to clear up the content security policy here. Yes, we have to change this one. Set data is the method that we're calling. There we go. Okay, so yes. Now we're back into our script right here. And the name of our form inside of here, that's my form. We'll give it the same ID as well, my form. So get element by ID. I can target my form using that. Or document.forms.myform is another way that you can access this form. We're listening for the submit event on the form. When the form is submitted, by default, it wants to be sent to whatever you have as the action here. So I can do this. This is where I want to send this form. I want to when I click the submit button, this is where I want to send it. So we should add a submit button here, actually. All right, so we have a button. When I click this button, the form wants to submit. Here, I'm finding the form, and I'm listening for the submit event, and I'm saying prevent default. So forms, what do they want to do by default? They want to submit. They want to send their data to someplace else, get a result, and then replace the current page. The browser will replace your current page with whatever the server sent back from submitting the form. I don't want to do that. I want to call a fetch. I want to decide for myself. I want to send some data here. That's what I want to do. So I listen for submit and I say, don't do the default thing. Don't actually try to load a new page. Don't send the data to what the action is. I'm going to tell you what to do. So we could, right here, create a JavaScript object. There's a JavaScript object. And then we can say our JSON string is going to be json.stringify our object. Now this can be the data that we're going to send to this endpoint. Let's create a request here. All right, so we're going to submit stuff to here with fetch. And the method that we're going to use to be able to upload data, I can't use get and upload data other than putting it in the query string. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to do a post. So this is an insert. We're adding new data. I want to create a new thing on the server. So there's that. And now, because I have something right here, I can take this string. A request of type post has a body, and this body can be a string. It can be a form data object, which is what we're going to use to upload files, or it can be some sort of iterable object. Most of the time, it's going to be form data or a string like this. Now, because this is a JSON string, I should, in my headers, set a content type to let the server know this text that I'm sending you is a JSON string. So content type, it's one of those headers that you are allowed to set in a request or a response. In the request, the content type is what you are uploading. It's not what you're requesting back. Remember, this endpoint is going to give me that string, just hello world. Right here, this hello world string is what's going to come back. Or sorry, from post, it's going to be, thanks for adding something. It's this string. It's text that's coming back. I'm not getting JSON back. I'm uploading JSON. So that's what the content type inside of a request is for. It's what are you uploading? All right, so there's our request. And now we can do our fetch. We're getting text back from the server, so that is going to be the method that we call the response.text. There we are. So we're uploading this object to the server. We're taking the object, we're turning it into a JSON string. It becomes the body, and this is how you upload any data. So when I click send, this is the response that we get back from the server. We've basically uploaded this object right here to the server. It said, thanks, send us back a response with a 201 status code. Because it was a post, right here, 201 status code. All right, now, files. If you want to upload files instead, we can, right here, in the body, instead of the JSON string, I'm going to create a form data object. So let's create a variable right here. Let fd equal new form data. Now I can create it like this and then start calling append. The same way we did with headers, the same way you can with URL search params, the query string parts. But inside of here, we've got name and value, like normal, but you can also have a file. So you could have a name, which is a label, and then an actual file object, and then there's an optional third parameter, which is the name for the file. Like, what do you want to call this file? So it's a JSON file, it's an image, it's a XML file, PDF, whatever it is. So you can come up with the file name that you want to use when uploading it. This is the label. So it's the variable that references the file or the string. And we can absolutely do that. We can come in here. We can say, all right, I want to get the file that's inside of here. So let's come down here and image input dot value. Let's console log that. Here, we'll put this back to the way it was, just so we don't get an error. Okay, so I'm going to pick an image file. There's this image. And when I send, there we go. This is my image. Now, if I jump back into my code here, and instead of value, which is what you would normally do for a text input, we can access a property called files. This is an array of all the files that were included. So in a browser, when you go choose file, if in the input element you add the attribute multiple, it means that you're allowed to select multiple files at the same time. But I don't have that, so I can only select one. This is still going to be an array, but if I access number 0 inside that array, that is going to be this one file, and it is a file object, just like the one that we created back when we were creating our own custom response objects back in step 3, I think it was, or step 4, where we were creating a response object. We built a file and we put that inside there. here is a file object coming from our own computer. So here's the name of the file, the type, the size. So we have all this information that we can get to about this file object. I can then put this inside of here. So we can say, in my form data, I want to append image file. That's the name I'm going to use. And then image input dot files number 0. That's the file object. And then what do you want to call it? Well, I'm going to call it whatever it was called on my computer. I could come up with a different name, but I'm just going to do this. files0.name. There we go. I have created a form data object, and I've put the file into the form data object. And then the body right here is going to be just this. It's just the form data object. That's the body that I'm uploading. And content type is no longer going to be this. It's actually going to be multipart / form data. Yes, there's an image, and the image has a type, but it's all bundled inside of a form data object. This is what we're uploading. So this is the type of this. So I pick a file. There it is. I send. There we go. Here's my response back from the server. I've actually just uploaded that file. And if I look in the network tab, I'll see the payload was actually a file that got uploaded. All right, so that's one object. Now, there is another way that we can do this. And that is here. In the form data object, when you create it, you can actually just pass in the form. So I could manually pick all the files that were being loaded and append each one of them into my form data object. But if you pass in your form, it's able to go and read through your form, and every element that has a name attribute, it has to be the name. It's not going to work with just ID. You have to have the name attribute. But anything with a name will automatically get added, as long as it's got a value, will automatically be added into this form data object. So now I'm actually going to upload multiple files because I said, yeah, everything inside my form. The body is going to be that. And that's what this multi-part stands for, is you're able to upload multiple objects. So I'm going to upload a JSON file, and I'm going to upload an image file. There we go. I've got the two different files. And you notice when I do this, how everything else is grayed out except for the image. That's because in my HTML, I added these accept attributes. So any kind of image or only JSON files. So when I send, there we go. Now let's take a look at the network tab to see what happened here. In the network tab, here is the fetch request, the post. Inside of here, there's my general things. There's the 201 status code coming back. There's where I was sending it to port 3000. My response came back. It was some text. My request, content type, multi-part form data, content length, that's for all the files, not just the one, but that's all the files. The payload, that's what I was uploading. So when you are uploading multiple things, when your content type right here is set to multi-part, this is what happens. These boundaries get created. So this is a string that will be repeated at the beginning of every single piece. So I had a JSON file. Content type was application JSON. Then I had an image file. Was this? And then there was nothing else. This is the end of the whole thing. So there's these boundaries, and it puts together the whole payload to be uploaded. So that is what we get by using a form data object, is the ability to have a whole bunch of things, including a whole bunch of files that we can bundle together as the body, setting this as the content type. we can send it to the server all as one package. All right, moving on to number 8, the one that so many people struggle with. Moving on to talk about CORS, cross-origin resource sharing. Now, this isn't so much a command that you call, it's not a method that you use, it's more a concept. It is a bunch of security that has been put in place. It's a policy that has been implemented by all the browsers. All the browser companies agreed on this policy. This is how we're going to protect users. We want to make sure that when the JavaScript running on a web page that comes from domain A is making a request to some other domain, some other origin, when that request is being made, we want to make sure that the data coming back, the browser and the server are both in agreement that, yes, you're allowed to have this data. And the settings in your fetch call, the settings in your request are not going to be something that's going to leak private information. So CORS, while it can be frustrating, while it can be difficult to wrap your head around at times, is a very necessary part to keep everyone safe. So, just a few notes for you that you can look back and reference to remember these things. So, requests that are not get method or a head method must include in the headers one header called origin, which is, hey, what's the origin that you're coming from? That will get sent to the server. The server looks at that and then decides, okay, I need to set some headers. There's going to be a header set by the server called access control allow origin. And then it's going to have a value, which oftentimes it's just an asterisk, meaning I don't care, anybody's allowed to access my data. But it is also possible for it to send back something like this. If the server sends back this header with this value, hey, that's where I'm running my thing. That's where my website is running. So that comes back from the server. My browser's going to look at that. It's going to look at my origin and say, hey, cool. You are allowed to do whatever you want to do. If you want to send cookies, you can send cookies. You don't have to, but I'm going to allow it. If you want to use the data that comes back from the server, that's fine too. You're allowed to use it. So you can take it, you can stick it in an image, you can put it on an HTML5 canvas, you can use it there. That's absolutely fine. The most common error that you get with CORS is the one that says access control allow origin header missing, or it doesn't have a value that matches your origin. And that just means that you either set something in your headers that went to the server, or you're using settings in your fetch request that the server didn't like, or the server is saying, no, from your domain, you're not allowed to do this. People who are writing the code on the server side may have even looked to see, okay, do you have your API key, that authorization header with the JSON web token, or an X API key header that has the API key? If you don't have those things, I'm not going to allow you to access the data. So it's going to turn this off, which means the browser is going to say, CORS error, you can't touch the data. Doesn't matter if it comes back, you're not allowed to touch it. So things that don't need this access control allow origin, the things that are allowed to go through are, if it's a simple request. So the method is head, get, or post. So get, we've talked about, it's just, hey, give me some data. Post, I'm uploading some data. I don't necessarily need a response, I'm just uploading some data. Head, it's like a get request or a post request, but all you're sending is the headers. You don't want a response, you don't care about a response other than the headers. I'm sending the request headers. I want the response headers back. Maybe I need to look and see if I'm getting the right headers. So if it's one of those three, okay, that's good. That means that it's a simple request. But if it's one of those three and the only headers that you're allowed to set in your request are these ones. So accept, what are the file types that you're going to accept back? Language, what's your preference for language if there's a choice between language of files? Content language, very much like accept language. Content type, I'm going to be uploading with post a JSON file. Okay, you're allowed to do that. Range, so I'm getting back a font file and I'm going to be wanting certain parts of the data. So that's the range header. Content type. If you're setting content type, these are the only allowed values that you can use. Application XWWW form URL encoded is what's used by default when a form is submitted. If you're actually uploading files instead of just text or data or a string, multi-part form data is what you have to use, or plain text, you can be uploading that. So I can't be posting a JSON file. I can't be uploading an image file, even though, oh yeah, it was one of these types. We also have the restriction that these are the only headers that can be set, and these are the only allowed types. If it falls outside of this, they're saying, okay, it's not just a basic, simple request. So we need more security in this case. And, the values for these ones, this is an additional restriction that was added on by some of the browsers. If you use accept language, content language, you're only allowed to use standard values. You can't make up your own values. You have to use ones that are part of the standard. And the last one is you cannot stream data from the browser to the server. It's got to be, here's the file, here's the whole file, there you go. It can't be a readable stream. You can't be streaming the data with unknown end to it. The request that goes out first, this options request. Now, we've talked about head, get, post. Options is another kind of request. It's another HTTP method, which was created specifically for cores. This is this pre-flight request, if you've ever heard of a pre-flight request. Basically, when the browser sees that you're going to be making a request to a different origin, it's going to create something very much like a head request. It's going to say, okay, here's some headers. I'm going to set the access control request method. I'm going to set the access control request headers. So I'm saying these are the headers. This is the method I'm going to be using. Here's my origin. There's a bunch of things that the browser is going to put inside of here. It's going to then send this request, which is just the headers, off to the server. The server will then figure out whether or not you are allowed, and it will send back headers, which will include this one, hopefully, access control allow origin, to say whether or not you're allowed to do it. And it's only after that initial request and exchange of headers that the browser will actually do your post or your get or your put or your patch or your delete, whatever the method is. It's only after this initial options request that your thing that you're trying to use fetch to do, it's only after that that it will actually go through. So, in the request object that you create, there is a mode property that we can set. So we've talked about credentials, where you can decide whether or not you want the cookies to be sent along. We've talked about cache as one of the options inside of there. So if you create a request, I don't have a request object right here, but if you were to create a request object, and there, let's just move that up so I can use it as the URL. In my options, we've talked about cache, and we can say that, Yeah, we're just going to use the default method for that. Credentials, let's set it to omit or same origin. We've got method. Well, we can do post, get, patch, put, delete, whatever we like. We've got headers, we've got the body. For get, we wouldn't have a body, but for post, we would. And the mode is the other one. And the values that we have right here, there we are. No course, same origin, navigate. If you put things to no course, you're telling the browser, oh no, don't worry about it. It's not a CORS request. Let's pretend that I'm not requesting to a different origin. So it's going to skip the options request. But if you didn't meet these requirements, if you were not using a simple request, guess what? Things will fail. Course is going to be the default value for this if you're actually making a cross-origin request. If you're making a fetch call to a different domain, this is going to be what the browser puts in there. But you're allowed to hard-code it. You can come in here and say, oh yeah, I'm making a CORS request. Look, I'm going to pixum.photos. This isn't where my web page is. My index.html is on 127.0.0.1 port 5500. It's not here. So yes, this is a CORS request. But I could do this. I could say, hey, it's a no CORS request. So I'm telling the browser, don't make a options request. Don't send that initial bunch of headers off to the server. Don't ask for an access control allow origin header to come back. So basically, I'm saying, well, I'm going to send a request off to the server, but I know that because it is cross-origin, I'm not going to get the thing that I'm asking for. That's what we're saying here. If you don't meet the requirements with here, when you set it to CORS, the options request will be made. You have to meet the requirement to get the right values back. If you set it to no CORS, it doesn't really change what's going to happen. It just means you're going to skip over the options thing, which means you're not going to have the header if it is a cross-origin request, and things are going to fail as well. Same origin means, hey, I'm making a request to the same origin, so you should try and stop me if I'm not making a request to the same origin. This would be something that you would use if you had a whole bunch of requests that were dynamically being made. You could create your own request object where you're just changing the URL. The request object will have the same settings for every single one of these requests. It's just the endpoint changes. You could set this as a default value for the request mode. And this last one, navigate, it's one that you can't set through JavaScript. It's the one that the browser will set. And basically, if you click on an anchor tag and you're navigating to a new page, you submit a form and it's loading a new page, that's a navigate action. Any action that's going to replace the current page is a navigate action. It's not something that you can set through JavaScript, though. These are the three you can set in JavaScript, but you can't get around the CORS requirement by changing these. Okay, now, if you didn't meet the requirements, it is possible. If you said, hey, I'm making a CORS request, you're saying, go ahead, make that pre-flight request. Good for you. Now, you've got it back, but you didn't get the answer from the server that you wanted. You didn't meet the criteria, so it's going to give you a CORS error, or it's going to give you the response object saying, okay, yeah, you got the response object, but because you didn't meet the CORS criteria, you're not allowed to get to the data. That is an opaque response. That's what it's called. Opaque responses can be generated when you say it's not CORS. So the request goes to the server, the request comes back, but it was a cross-origin request. The contents come back. If it's text that you're going to use inside of a script tag or a link tag, or it's an image, video, audio that you're going to put on the page, or the content for an iframe, an embed, or an object, okay, you can take that text or that image and display it in one of those containers. If it's an image that you're requesting that you're trying to use inside of an HTML5 canvas, it will not let you. If it's a web font, it will not let you. If you're using the cache API and you're calling the add or add all methods, it's not going to let you. The HTTP status code for an opaque response is going to be 0. So I have a couple of examples on this page right here. I'm going to do 2 fetch calls for the image, this image right here. Now let's make it the same as the other ones, 300 wide, 200 high. So I'm going to make 2 requests for the image, 2 requests for this local JSON file. So the JSON file is local. It's right here on my domain, my origin. So those are not CORS calls. So setting no CORS, or using the default, which is core, which would be whatever the origin is. Here, we can go in here and actually change it. Now, I can say CORS. It's not a cross-origin request, but I can say CORS. Same thing up here. I'm not specifying it, but because it is an external URL, it means that this is a CORS request. We can take a look to see at the values that we're getting back here. There we go. So my 2 local requests for the JSON file. Doesn't matter if I set the mode to CORS or no CORS. It works. There's no restrictions. I can do whatever I want with that data. Here, for the image, I'm going to the Pixum website. When I set it to CORS, I've met all the requirements. I'm not sending my cookies. I'm not doing anything weird. So it comes back with a 200. By setting it to no CORS, I get a 0 as my status code. This is an opaque response. This is the kind of response that comes back that says, okay, you sent a request, you sent some data, I got the stuff back in the browser, but JavaScript is not allowed to touch it. You're not allowed to do anything like put the data into a canvas or use the web font as part of your CSS because you didn't meet the security requirements. So that is what an opaque response. If you ever see this status code 0, that's what it means. It means that you got an opaque response. You didn't meet the CORS requirements. So the last takeaway here is when you get an opaque response, or when you want to get an opaque response, if you don't want to go through all the hurdles of making sure that all the things are correct, you want to just say, oh yeah, okay, treat it like a no CORS request. I'm ignoring the CORS policy. When you do that, it's not that you're saying, okay, I don't care or let my page break. It's, I don't care about getting a response back from the server. I want to save time. Maybe I don't want to wait for the pre-flight request and then my actual request to go to the server. Maybe the person's got a very slow internet connection. I don't need to get the result back. All I need to do is send some data to the server. Okay, great. Go ahead. Send the data to the server. Upload the file. If that's all you care about doing, if you don't want to deal with or don't want to work with the response, you don't have to. So that's what it is. And we talked about response headers and forbidden header names before. This list right here in the response, this is a safe list. So when you look through the response and the request header names, you will find a section called CORS safe listed response headers. So this is the list of names that you will have that CORS will send you back, that CORS will let you access through JavaScript. CORS will prevent you accessing some header names. So if I make a request to my domain versus another domain, I will have a different set of headers that I'm allowed to access in JavaScript in the response objects. These are the ones that if I'm making a CORS request, that I'm still allowed to access through JavaScript. All right. Moving on to dealing with multiple requests. So how do we deal with multiple requests? All right, moving into here. Now, when I say multiple requests, I'm not saying uploading multiple files. We've already talked about doing that. I'm talking about times when I need to talk to multiple servers, or I need to talk to multiple endpoints on a server, and I want to get all the data at the same time, or I need to get the data in a specific order. So there's a sequence, or I have to do everything at the same time. So to do everything at the same time, the promise object, the thing that fetch uses internally, has a method called all, meaning I want to get responses from all these promises. I'm going to pass in an array of promises, and when I get the response from all of them, that's when I'm going to work with them. Race means I'm going to give you an array of promises. Give me the first thing that comes back. All settled is give me the array when everything is successfully done. So I'm just going to use promise.all. I have another video talking about all these, or videos talking about promise.all, promise.race, all settled, and so on. For right now, I'm just going to use promise.all. The sequence is the simpler one. The sequence be something like this. So if I do image str for my fetch, I can do this. I can say, then we get our response, we do our check. Now, this would be where we could return it. We can extract the blob, but we can also use this as a trigger to say, all right, I've got my first response. Now I need to get my second one. So instead of returning the blob, I'm going to say return fetch, and here's my other file. So it's going to return a promise, which down here, hey, it's another response object. And we can do the same thing as we did right here inside this one. Now, I do want to get this blob as well, so maybe I will save that. We'll say up here, this would be my image response, and we'll have our JSON response. So we're saving that inside of here. And this can even be blob. There we go. So I'm putting the promise that will eventually give us the blob inside of this variable. And then inside of here, I can do the JSON response is response.json. There we go. There's the two promises inside of there. Now, where we want to deal with them inside of the next then. I have two things that are promises, image response and JSON response. So I can use promise.all. So we can say right here, return promise.all, and this is an array being passed in, image response and JSON response. Now, inside of here, what's going to get passed into here is going to be an array. It's going to be an array that has the blob and the JSON turned into a JavaScript object. So I can use destructuring to say, in here, here's my function. Inside of here, I've got my image blob, and I've got my data object. Those two things. So we'll just write out the data object. And there we have it. So we're going to fetch the image first. When that comes back, when we've got the response, I'm going to save this blob here, or the promise that will resolve to a blob inside of here, and then I'm going to call the next fetch. When I get the response for the next one, I will extract the JSON, and then I will wrap those two promises, the promise that resolves to a blob, the promise that's going to resolve to a JSON file, turned into a JavaScript object. those two things will get passed here. So the promise.all will sit right here when both of them have finished resolving. Then I get an array that contains the blob and the JavaScript object. And there it is. There is our JavaScript object. So we went to the random data API. We got 10 users. That's what's inside the data object. And if I write out the blob, that should just give me a blob. It'll tell me the size of that. There it is. There's the size and the type. So those are the two things that we got back. So that was the sequence. And if you just want to go directly to the promise.all, the other way that we can do this, if you want to get them all at the same time, you can do this. You can say promise.all. It's an array. .then, .catch. So inside of here, I will pass in fetch for the image string and fetch for the JSON string. So there's my two fetch calls. They're inside of an array, and this then will have an array with two responses. So image response and JSON response. And we'll have to wrap that in parentheses, the array that is. There we go. So I have two response objects here, and I have to do the same thing that I did here to be able to extract, or rather here, the response blob, response JSON. I have to return a promise.all, which is an array, and inside of the array is my image res.blob. That's the first promise, and the JSON res.json, that's the second promise. So in my final then, what I'm going to be getting inside of this array is the blob and the JSON data. So two different ways of writing it, but achieving the same thing. Here, or achieving similar things. Here, I'm saying I want to do both fetch calls at the same time. When I get both responses, I'll extract the data at the same time and then work with the data at the same time. Here, I wanted to do the image response first and then fetch the second one. So we can add another then and work with the data here. This fetch could be in a next step. So I could return response.blob down to the next one, and then in the next one, I do something with the image and then call fetch. So let's make that change. So we're going to return that, which means this is no longer in here. So in this second one right here, what we're getting back is the blob. And in here we can work with the blob, add image to the page, etc. Whatever you want to do. Then we do the fetch for the JSON. And then here's the JSON response. So you can break it up into this series of steps using the then. And this is one of the reasons that I prefer the then. To me, this just feels more logical to break it up into the steps. I can say do this, then this, then this, then this. And I will often turn these into functions of their own. So instead of writing the code right there, I will just have the function names. And this will just be a series of thens with function names inside of them. Do this, then this, then this, then this. So each one of these is this little atomic pure function that we can do. All right. And that brings us into step 10, our final step, the abort. So this one will be a fairly quick one. If you want to stop a fetch call, what we can do is have somebody click on a button or do some other interaction with the page to stop a fetch call that has already begun. So let's add a URL inside of here. Here, I'll just grab one from the previous page. Here's from the multiple one. Let's do this. All right, now let's make this a much bigger one. So we'll say it's 3,000 pixels wide, 2,000 pixels high. So it's a much bigger image, so it's going to take a little bit longer. To do an abort, to stop a fetch call, you have to create an abort controller. So there's an abort controller object. It has a property called signal. This signal property is what we pass into our request object or a fetch object. So let's create a request object. Let's break this into steps to follow what we're doing previously. In the options here, we can say there's a property called signal, if I could spell it correctly. There it is, like this. Now you can just put the word signal. It's the same property and value, the same variable for the value as the property name. So you can just write the word signal. I'll write both just to make it clear here. And we pass this request in here. All right, so when we don't get responses back, so the network fails, that will trigger an error. If we don't have the right status code, if we're throwing an error inside of here, it'll trigger this. The abort will also trigger an error. So let's take our response. And this is an image, so I'll call the blob method, not that we're going to be doing anything with it. So here's our blob. So I'm just going to write out that message. All right, so let's test this out. Back in main, we'll make sure that we're on number 10. There we go. Oh, I need a function. Yes. All right, so let's do that. So export function get data. There we are. Now we have the function. There it is. Got the blob. All right, so it did the fetch. There we go. Now let's slow this down a little bit. In the network tab, there is throttling. So let's go to slow 3G just so we can slow this request down a little bit. Refresh the page, and it'll take a second. This is going. So the fetch is being made. We're still waiting. We're still waiting. We're still waiting. Eventually, we will get that image back, and it will write the message. So we can check the network tab here even. There we go. Got the blob. Okay, so it finally came back with the result. So we know it's going to take a while. That's going to give us a little bit of time to work with. I want to go into my HTML and I'm going to add an abort button. So I'll put it right underneath this image. And there's the abort button right there. I'm going to change this throttling to fast 3G instead of slow 3G just to speed it up a little tiny bit. So there's our abort button, and we're going to listen for clicking on that abort button. So we will say right here, when this function runs, we're going to let abort btn equal document get element by ID. That's our button, and we'll add the event listener for the click event. When that happens, what do we want to do? we want to stop this fetch call. So in our request, we have that signal. That signal is the signal property from the abort controller that we created. Basically, we've just attached something to the fetch call so that we can reference it later on. Inside of the button click right here, our controller, we do that. That's all we have to do. Access the controller and call its abort method, and then whatever has this signal connected to it will be stopped. So let's refresh the page and click abort. There we go. We aborted it, and here is the error. DOM exception, the user aborted a request. I didn't have that in my code. I'm just saying console.warn. My error says invalid. This is the abort right here that we're doing. That triggers an error. So we're inside the fetch. We haven't got the response yet. We aborted it at this stage. It triggers an error that comes down here, and the error is this DOM exception error. See? Right there is where it's triggered inside this getData method. All right, and those are the 10 steps. Now, I also threw in here a bonus for you. If you ever want to measure the download progress. With Fetch, it is not possible currently to measure the upload progress. So if you are submitting something to the server, there's no way for us to measure the upload progress. But we can measure the download progress. When you do your fetch call, it is possible to use a reader object. The body is an actual stream. So this is a data stream, this body object. And the body object is inside the response. Remember the file, the JSON file, the image, they're inside the body of the HTTP response? Well, we have a built-in thing called getReader, which will create a reader object that lets you read the file as it's being downloaded. So we can get from the headers the content length so we know the size of it. And what's going to happen is we're going to call this read method on the reader that we created. So we're going to continually, every time we get a chunk of data, we'll read it. Another chunk, we read it. Another chunk, we read it. Another chunk, we read it. And we just save all the chunks inside of an array. So we're calling push. When we call read, we get a value. We put that into the array. So we have this array called chunks. And once we're done the whole thing, so we're going to keep going until the reader says, hey, you've got no more data. The done value is true. When that happens, we're going to exit from our loop. We're going to take the total bytes that were downloaded. We're going to create a byte array. And then we're going to loop through the array. And we're going to put all the chunks of data that's inside this array into our byte array. Once we have that, we're going to create a blob object with the byte array, which is going to be our image. And then remember our old trick with create object URL. We can take that byte array, reassemble it. It's going to be the blob that we then load into our image. So if we swap over to number 11 here, and there we go. So it's loading the progress, done, and then the image appears. So that's the download progress, and this example is using a blob, but if it were text, you could also just do this. So create a new text decoder, say this is the encoding that we're using. Take the byte array that we created up here, filled with all the chunks of data, and decode it. So take all the data that you got, treat it as if it's a UTF-8 string, put it into this variable right here, and then if it's a JSON string, you can call JSON.parse. If it's just a string, just take the string and do whatever it is that you want to do with it on your web page. But it will have given you the progress as it was occurring. All right, and that's it. You now know everything that there is to know that you will need to know about fetch. So, I hope that helps. I hope you enjoyed that. If you have any questions, feel free to leave those in the comments. I answer as many as I have time for. And as always, thanks for watching.